In this episode of
him a copy because he said he was opening up a clinic in Los Angeles, sent him a copy of the license without doing any other verification other than that.
Now, the Orange County District Attorney's Office hopes to stop him cold.
Never mind, he wasn't a doctor. There was a connection between what he should have done, what he didn't do, and the death of McKenzie.
1981, the con man pleads guilty in a plea bargain to the charges of manslaughter and practicing medicine without a license. He is sentenced to 3 years in prison. To the family of John McKenzie, the sentence does not seem to fit the crime, and the victim's 4-year-old daughter, Jill, is left without a father.
He was a nice young man with a lot of life ahead of him. Is that he and Jill had that taken away.
And there is another victim still, the man whose good name was tainted by the imposter.
My wife tells me she was driving to a nearby town and she heard on the radio that Dr. Gerald Barnes had been arrested and found guilty of manslaughter.
The real Dr. Gerald Barnes is a well-respected idea that is identical.
All just a big mistake.
In 1996, life is good for Lisa Roberts and her husband, Dr. Gerald Barnes. The couple has been married just over a year.
It was very romantic, and along with the courtship, there were, concerts, charmed the girl right off her feet.
While Dr. Barnes earns a 6-figure salary as medical director at a Los Angeles clinic, Lisa makes plans for their future together.
My expectations were that we would have children, and at some point we would be able to save enough money to start his own practice.
The doctor and his wife, Barnes, runs into $1 million, and the company is now out of business.
Money. Follow the money. It's always about money.
For Lisa Roberts, who was once married to Gerald Barnbaum, and now refers to her phony husband as the never was. The ability for the con man to perpetrate his fraud over and over again comes down to one thing: greed.
It's all about money for his companies. It was about money for the people who he worked for before that apparently knew that there was something wrong and had fired him for a variety of reasons, but said nothing to anyone.
Gerald Barnbaum is now 74 years old. He is serving his sentence at Waseca Federal Prison in Minnesota. His projected release date is in 2018.
Won't make any difference. Now he can be a almost semi-retired physician, and no doubt when he walks through those doors, he will be a physician again.
Next, on American Greed, he hit 43 banks in 6 states.
There was a demand note indicating, "I have a gun, be quiet."
A serial bandit who can't be stopped. Only 2 years, and now the hunt is on. Louisville, Kentucky, the River City, gateway to the South. On November 11, 2002, the city falls prey to a bank robber who targets banks list of cities he's targeting. His weapons, a simple disguise and a threatening note. His take today, $6,000. Louisville Metro Detective Larry Duncan draws the case. Duncan's been chasing robbers for the past 11 years.
There was a demand note indicating, "This is a holdup. I have a gun. Be calm." Both.
The note is clean. No fingerprints. The robber is a white male who appears to be in his early. Duncan, Schlee, and Freihofer team up to form the IBM task force. They suspect the bandit of at least 20 robberies, but are no closer to identifying them. Just before sunset on a Friday night, the task force catches an unexpected break.
In June of 2003, a bank robbery occurred in...
It's IBM's 29th robbery. A surveillance camera at the Meyer grocery store captures this photo of IBM's getaway.
you're actually able to see the IBM Bandit entering the back seat of the getaway vehicle. And clearly, you're able to determine that it is a black, late 90s model, four-door BMW IL.
Into what we assumed was his safe zone in Indiana.
Detective Duncan uses that theory to formulate a plan to catch IBM. He calls it Operation Intercept. Top back home to Indiana. Duncan selects 5 banks in the Louisville metro area that fit the bandits' MO.
We would put undercover cars and undercover detectives as tellers inside these banks so that when he hit, we would be right on top of him.
Officers would then use police radios to coordinate IBM's capture.
So the idea was to bring over
about 1,200 officers on operational alert. On September 6, 2003, with the trap set and baited, IBM robs a U.S. bank in Louisville just to the news. 1 week passes without even a fleeting glimpse of IBM or the black BMW.
And finally, I call the commander of the operation and I say, look, we've blown it. He's not hitting. And he said, are you asking to call it off? And I was like, yeah, I'm asking to call it off. We've missed our chance. He's gone.
Get another shot at the IBM Bandit. For more information and special web exclusives, log on to americangreed.cnbc.com. "16 months and 35 banks into the crime spree, $36,000. And only 2 people know his true identity. One is the blonde female who drives the getaway car. The other is a 46-year-old self-proclaimed entrepreneur with a shady past named David Branco. David Branco is the IBM Bandit.
The first time I met David, he was impeccably dressed.
Phil.
I very much regret the damage done to our friends, and I really feel responsible for having caused that to happen, and I very much regret that.
Branco skips town with his wife and young son and drives southwest, landing in Vincennes, Indiana. There, he finds his next mark.
He was a very self-pitying character who blamed everything on everyone else, including and mostly his mother. He was hoping he could become the most successful bank robber.
David Branco, it turns.
He's a sociopath in the sense that he had absolutely no conscience.
You could ask anybody in this town that shops with me. I'd give you my shirt off my back if I could help you out. And they'll tell you I would. That hurts.
David Branco's success as the IBM Bandit has been a perfect mix of luck, skill, and planning. But as 2003 draws to a close, one mistake is about to change everything.
If he was going to come up with a gun, I wanted to have mine out first.
December of 2003. In the nearly 4 months since the IBM Bandit escaped Operation Intercept, David Branco and Donna Hewins have been very busy, committing another 8 robberies, bringing the total to 43. And 4 more months of payments have cost the Logans an additional $2,000. On December 29th, David Branco is visiting Bloomington.
He's running people off the road. He's disregarding stop signs, driving right through intersections.
The BMW sedan leaves Detective Hill's Ford Taurus in the dust. David Branco escapes the police yet again. But this time, he leaves a vital clue in their hands, an Indiana driver's license. Just across the Wabash River from Illinois sits Vincennes, Indiana. Vincennes last.
This is the house at 1919 Hickory that David Branco lived at when the state police were looking for the stolen plate. Trooper Trotter arrived and saw the garage door was open and saw the vehicle and the plate. Shortly after that, David Branco came out and got in his car.
Branco leads the Indiana State Police on a chase.
Was coming down College, and I heard John Trotter say that he was out on foot. Branco had abandoned his child in the car, and so Trooper Trotter was staying with the child at that time with the car.
Brankel runs, trying to lose Sergeant Winkler in the maze of apartment buildings.
As he was coming up to one of the apartment complexes, he tripped on the curb and fell down.
And receives 21 years behind bars. Since David Brankel...
He had no remorse towards the Sperrys, and he claims that he did legitimate work for the Logans and that he didn't rip them off.
Now, David Brankel is a con man, but if that man had used his intelligence and all the good things about David to do good instead of using it to do bad and do evil, he could have accomplished great things in his life.
Entire denomination. How did we let a man like Kratz lead us so far into the wilderness? A young pastor asked at the annual meeting. The answer was uncomfortable. They liked the numbers. They liked the prestige. They had confused a growing balance sheet with a growing ministry. In Phoenix, many local SBC churches struggled to keep their doors open. The trust had been so thoroughly violated that many members stopped giving altogether, not because they didn't believe in God, but because they no longer believed in the men who managed his money. It will take 40 years to walk out of this desert, one deacon remarked, looking at the empty pews. We spent 20 years building a temple to money, and it fell on our heads. Now we have to learn to build a temple to the truth again. Chapter 23, the final audit. In the end, every life is an audit. For William Kratz, the audit resulted in a bankrupt legacy. He died a few years after his release, still insisting he was a visionary. His funeral was a small, quiet affair, attended only by family and a few loyalists who still held onto the mirage. There were no steeples built in his honor. For Ronald Michaels, the audit is ongoing. He remains in the shadow of the executioner, his magic hands long since stilled. He is a footnote in the history of medical fraud, a man who became a monster because he couldn't stop the flow of blood into his own bank account. But for Joyce Brannon, for the Andersons, and for Robert Shaw, the audit is different. Their legacy isn't in what they lost, but in what they held on to. They proved that faith is not a financial instrument. They proved that a person's worth is not found in a Medicare billing code. And they proved that even in the darkest basement or the hottest desert, the truth has a way of rising like the sun over the Arizona horizon or the wind off the lake in Chicago clearing the air, revealing the stones and showing us the way home. Chapter 24, The Whistleblower's Isolation. Kyle Tresh sat in his small, dimly lit apartment in Tulsa, months after leaving Phoenix. The silence was his only companion. He had thought that by doing the right thing, he would find peace, but the truth was much heavier than he had anticipated. He remembered the day he sent the final packet of evidence to the Arizona Corporation Commission. His hands had been cold, and the simple act of licking the envelope felt like a betrayal of his upbringing. He was a preacher's son. He had been taught to protect the flock, not to expose the shepherds. Am I the one hurting them? He asked his reflection in the dark window. The phone rang occasionally. Lawyers, investigators, sometimes former colleagues who whispered warnings about Bill Kratz's political connections. He had been blacklisted in the local legal community. No one wanted to hire the man who had brought down the Baptist Foundation. But then he would think of the accountants who had stood with him, for men who had risked their careers to say, "No more." They were his only anchor. Together, they had built a fortress of paper and ink that Kratz's spiritual rhetoric couldn't penetrate. It's not just about the money. Kyle, his father, had told him during one of their long, late-night calls. It's about the soul of the church. If we allow a lie to live at the altar, we have no altar left. Tresh took those words to heart during the long, grinding years of the investigation. He became a man of shadows, a ghost in the legal system. But his integrity remained the only thing the BFA couldn't audit. Chapter 25, The Reporter's Vigil. Terry Green Sterling understood that the best stories aren't found in press releases. They are found in the trash cans and the public records rooms. For 6 months, she lived in the basement of the Maricopa County Recorder's office, following a money trail that seemed to loop back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. She was a veteran, a woman who had seen the worst of Phoenix's boom and bust cycles. But the BFA was different. It was an oasis in the desert, a place where righteousness and profit were supposed to be one and the same. They're using God as a guarantor, Terry told her editor, her eyes bloodshot from staring at microfiche. It's brilliant. If you doubt the investment, you're doubting the gospel. She faced threats. Anonymous letters warned her to leave the man of God alone. But Terry was a seeker of truth. She tracked down the homeowners who lived on the land Allo had bought. She found people who had never heard of the Baptist Foundation, even though their property was listed as a multi-million-dollar asset on the BFA books. Her articles, published in the Phoenix New-Times, were the first cracks in the mirage. They weren't just reporting, they were an exorcism. She revealed that while Kratz was singing hymns, he was burying the life savings of 11,000 people under a mountain of sham sales and worthless iOS. When the foundation finally collapsed, Terry didn't celebrate. She went back to the office and began writing about the victims. She knew that the story wouldn't be over until the last senior citizen had a place to sleep. Chapter 26, The Tragedy of Charles Labosco. Charles Labosco was an 80-year-old man who just wanted to be important. He was a patient of Dr. Michael's, a man who had seen more surgeries on his feet than any human being in history 351, to be exact. But Labosco wasn't a victim in the traditional sense. He was a partner in the lie. Michael's had promised him a cut of the Medicare checks, a little extra cash, to make his final years comfortable. In exchange, Labosco signed every form, verified every ghost surgery, and even helped Michael's scout for other cooperative patients. He was my friend, Labosco told the feds during his initial interview, his voice a mixture of defiance and shame. He cared about me when no one else did. He gave me a sandwich. He gave me tea. The government has plenty of money. Why shouldn't Ronnie have some? This was the toxic friendship Maikos used as a foundation for his fraud. He didn't just buy silence. He bought loyalty. He turned Lebowski into a human shield, knowing that the feds would hesitate to prosecute an 80-year-old man with a heart condition. But when the murder of Joyce Brannon happened, Lebowski's world shattered. He realized that the nice doctor he had protected was a killer. The chilling call Berkowitz inadvertently placed to him and the subsequent wiretapped conversation with Maikos revealed a man caught between greed and terror. Lebowski died a year after the trial, his name forever a footnote in a case of blood and billing codes. He was a reminder that when you dance with the devil, you can't choose when the music stops. Chapter 27, The Ripple of Change. The collapse of the Baptist Foundation of Arizona didn't just end a fraud. It changed the way religious nonprofits were governed across the United States. New laws were passed, oversight committees were formed, and the term stewardship was finally reclaimed from the hands of the predators. The Southern Baptist Convention, once a bastion of financial secrecy, became a model of transparency, though. The cost of that lesson was nearly $600 million and the broken hearts of 11,000 people. In Chicago, the Medicare Fraud Task Force was tripled in size. The Maikos case became the textbook example of how a white-collar crime can escalate into violence. They learned that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones in the streets. They are the ones who believe their own bedside manner makes them untouchable. But the real change happened in the hearts of the survivors. Bill Anderson, Robert Shaw, and the congregation at Bethany Evangelical Lutheran learned that trust is not something to be given blindly. They learned that the house of God is not a building or a balance sheet, but the integrity of the people within it. Chapter 28, The Trial of the Soul. The courtroom in 2005 was a place of sterile lighting and heavy oak, but it felt like a battlefield where the weapons were words and the prize was the remnants of 1,000 broken dreams. Bill Kratt sat at the defense table, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on some point in the air above the judge's head. The divide in the gallery was palpable. On one side sat the disgruntled's, as Kratz's legal team called them, led by Bill Anderson and Robert Shaw. They were the ones who had lost their homes, their health, and their peace. On the other side sat a small, fierce group of believers. They were people like Katie Moss, who refused to believe that Kratz had a dishonest bone in his body. He was a man of God, Katie whispered during a recess, her voice trembling with conviction. The state just wanted to take him down because he was too successful. If they had left him alone, the real estate would have saved us all. The prosecutor, armed with 1,000,000 pages of evidence, didn't argue with her faith. Instead, he showed the jury the numbers. He showed the sham sales to Alo that happened on the very days Kratz was preaching about blessing. This wasn't an investment strategy, the prosecutor said, his voice echoing in the silent room. This was a smokescreen. Every time a member of this church put money into the BFA, it wasn't building a kingdom. It was filling a hole that was already 10 sizes too big. The defense tried to flip the script, blaming the regulators for the collapse. If BFA had not been shut down, no one would have lost a penny. The defense attorney shouted. It was the ultimate what if, a hollow promise that ignored the hundreds of millions of dollars that were already gone. But when Bill Anderson took the stand, the what-ifs died. He talked about the night Pat's aneurysm almost took her. He talked about the trust they put in the BFA to secure her future. And he talked about the 2 heart attacks that followed the realization that they were broke. It wasn't just the money, Bill said, looking directly at Kratz. It was the fact that you used the name of my Lord to take it. You made our lives a living hell, and you did it with a smile. Chapter 29, The Ballistics of Betrayal. In Chicago, the trial of Dr. Ronald Michos was not a battle of faith, but a battle of cold, hard physics. The prosecution brought in ballistics experts to discuss the .22 caliber revolver Michos had retrieved from the Skokie police just 3 days before Joyce Brannon was murdered. They showed the jury the shell casing found under the driver's seat of Michos' car. The firing pin impressions match, the expert testified. The rifling on the bullets recovered from Ms. Brannon's body is consistent with the weapon the defendant possessed. But the most devastating evidence was the Palm Pilot. It was a digital map of a killer's intent. Sean Berkowitz walked the jury through the entries. Sunday, 17 o'clock. Church service ends. Crowds thinning. Sunday, 19:15. Basement window dark. Caretaker home. He wasn't just checking on a patient, Berkowitz told the jury. He was calculating the timing of an execution. He knew exactly when Joyce Brannon would be most vulnerable. He knew her schedule because he had spent years pretending to be her friend. The defense tried to paint Michos as a victim of a government conspiracy, a man who had fallen into alcoholism and depression because the feds were harassing him. But the evidence of the 351 surgeries on Charles Labosco made that argument impossible. He was the highest paid podiatrist in Illinois for a reason, the prosecutor said. Not because his hands were magic, but because his bills were fiction. And when Joyce Brannon threatened to expose the fiction, he turned his magic hands into the hands of a murderer. Chapter 30, Redemption's Slow Road. After the gavel fell and the prison doors closed, the victims were left with a silence that was almost as heavy as the fraud itself. Robert Shaw found his redemption not in a settlement check, but in a small office in Scottsdale. He became a volunteer counselor for people who had lost everything to financial scams. He used his own story, the car washing, the house selling, the betrayal as a bridge to help others cross the river of their own anger. I still scrub hubcaps in my mind sometimes, Robert told a group of retirees one evening. But I realize now that the dirt I was cleaning off those cars was nothing compared to the dirt Bill Kratz put on our souls. The only way to get clean is to tell the truth. In Phoenix, Bill Anderson's heart finally found a steady rhythm. He and Pat moved into a smaller apartment. Their lives simplified by necessity, but enriched by a newfound clarity. They no longer looked for oases in the desert. They looked for the small, real joys at granddaughter's graduation, a quiet morning together, the simple fact that they had survived. We lost our faith in a foundation, Pat said, her hair now completely white, but her eyes sharp. But we found our faith in each other, and that's an investment that never goes bankrupt. The Joyce Brannon Healing Center in Chicago continued its work, a living monument to a woman who knew what a real surgery looked like and what a real person looked like. It remained a place where the steeples cast a shadow of protection, not of greed. Epilogue: the stone remains. In the desert of Arizona, the Baptist Foundation is a ghost, its name a warning to future generations about the danger of mixing the gospel with the greed of men. The mirage has faded, leaving only the scorched earth and the hard, cold reality of what was taken. In the federal records, Ronald Michaels is a number on death row, a grim reminder of how far a man can fall when he believes his own bedside manner is a license to kill. The stories of William Kratz and Ronald Michaels are two sides of the same counterfeit coin. They are reminders that trust is a sacred thing, and when it is broken, the fragments can cut deeper than any blade. They are reminders that the most dangerous predators do not hide in the shadows, they stand in the light, wearing the vestments of our most cherished institutions. The desert mirage always fades, leaving only the sand. The winter wind always dies down, leaving only the cold. In the end, after the money is gone and the blood has been washed away, all that remains is the truth. And the truth, however painful, is the only thing that could truly set a soul free. The end full novel expansion minus 20,000 word path. Funny Money, a novelization of greed. Prologue, the cost of the chase. The American dream is a flickering neon sign. For some, it represents the steady glow of a porch light after a hard day's work. For others, it's the blinding strobe of a casino floor promise that the next roll, the next pitch, the next disruptive idea will finally lift them into the pantheon of the untouchables. Greed isn't a sudden fever. It's a slow-growing rot. It begins with a legitimate ambition and desire to be more than a footnote in history. But somewhere between the first million and the 100th, the goalpost moves. The man who wanted to be comfortable now wants to be a king. The man who wanted to be a king now wants to be a god. This is the story of to such men. One built a kingdom on the insecurities of the bedroom, the other on the aspiration of the locker room. Both discovered that when you build a house of cards, the wind always finds a way in. Part I, The Smiling Architect. Chapter 1, the basement, and the Bone Deep Drive. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1996. The air in the basement was thick with the scent of damp concrete and cheap caffeine. Stephen Warshak, 37 years old and possessed of a kinetic, restless energy, paced the small perimeter of his makeshift headquarters. The offices of Berkeley Nutraceuticals were a far cry from the glass and steel towers of Fortune 500 companies. Here, the hum of the dehumidifier competed with the scratch of pens on legal pads. Mom, did we get the authorization on the last batch of cards? Steve asked, his eyes darting to a stack of papers. His mother, a woman who had traded her retirement for her son's vision, nodded without looking up. The machine is slow today, Steve, but the orders are coming in. The ad in the back of the magazine. It's working. Steve stopped pacing. He looked at the modest operation. He saw the shoestring budget, the handwritten ledgers, and the flickering fluorescent lights. But in his mind's eye, he saw something else. He saw a fleet of trucks. He saw a product on every shelf in America. He understood something fundamental about the human psyche that most MBA letters missed. People weren't just buying supplements, they were buying hope. They were buying a version of themselves that was stronger, more confident, and more capable. It's not enough, Steve whispered. The back page ads are for the desperate. We need to go mainstream. We need a face. We need a feeling. Warshak was a charismatic man, a go-getter who could sell ice to an Arctic explorer. He had a vision of a world where male enhancement wasn't a taboo subject discussed in whispers, but a lifestyle choice celebrated with a wink and a nod. He sat down at a cluttered desk and began to sketch. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to create a monster. He was about to create Smiling Bob. Chapter 2, The Phenomenon of the Grin. By 2001, the shoestring operation had become a multi-million-dollar empire. Steve Warshak was no longer pacing a basement. He was orchestrating a cultural takeover from a high-end production suite. The birth of Smiling Bob was not an accident. It was a calculated strike at the American male's ego. The ads were slick, colorful, and relentlessly upbeat. They featured Bob, a man whose joy was so radiant it bordered on the absurd. He didn't just walk, he glided. He didn't just smile, he beamed with the secret knowledge of a man who had conquered his own biology. Look at his posture, Warshak told the editors, pointing at the screen. I want him to look like he's just won the lottery and found the fountain of youth at the same time. The innuendo is our shield. We don't have to say what the pill does. The grin says it all. The commercials were a masterclass in psychological subtext. Bob playing golf with an extra spring in his step. Bob whistling while he mowed the lawn. The neighbors looking on with a mix of envy and curiosity. The taglines were catchy, promising natural male enhancement and a happy missus at home. And Zeit began to flood the market. It moved from the back pages of Playboy and Penthouse to the bright, sterile shelves of Walmart, Walgreens, and CVS. Rorschach was spending millions on airtime, buying slots on major cable networks that usually hosted pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer. He was playing their game, but with none of the rules. Inside the corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was electric. Revenue was approaching $100 million. To the outside world, Stephen Rorschach was the ultimate entrepreneur. But inside, the smiling architect was building a machine that required a constant intake of fresh credit card numbers to keep its gears turning. Chapter 3, The Call Center Crucible. John Bradley walked onto the floor of the Berkeley call center and felt the immediate wall of sound. Hundreds of operators sat in cramped cubicles, their headsets glowing with active calls. This was the engine room of the Empire. Remember the script. John shouted over the din. We're not just selling a bottle. We're selling the continuity program. The first sample is free, but the lifeblood is the automatic billing. John had been a believer. He liked the way Rorschach paid on time, liked the energy of a growing company. But as he moved into a leadership role in customer service, the American dream started to smell like a scam. He watched a young operator struggle with a call. Sir, I understand you want to cancel, the operator said, her voice wavering. But our system shows you haven't completed the initial 3-month cycle. The blood flow takes time to stretch the vessels. Yes, length and roundness. If you cancel now, you'll lose all the progress you've made. John knew the truth. Most men didn't experience any change. Like Ryan, a customer who had paid for $100 for an 8-month supply. They were waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. They told me it was a processing delay. Ryan later recounted. Every month for 6 months, I called. Every month they promised it was fixed. They were just waiting for me to get tired. They were counting on my embarrassment to keep me quiet. Chapter 4, The Phantom in the Machine. The Michael Johnson Protocol was Rorschach's masterstroke of corporate evasion. Whenever a customer reached a level of anger that threatened a charge back, the script called for the ultimate escalation. I'm transferring you to our Vice President of Operations, Michael Johnson, the rep would say with practiced sincerity. The caller would be met with a sophisticated voicemail system, or sometimes a transfer to a dead-end line. Michael Johnson was the man who was always in a meeting, always on a flight, always just about to call you back. He was the human personification of a 400 for error page. It was genius, John Bradley recalled during the later investigation. By the time they realized Michael Johnson wasn't coming, another billing cycle had hit. We weren't just taking their money. We were stealing their time. And time is the one thing you can't get a refund for. But the arrogance of the operation wasn't limited to fake executives. It extended to the very biology of the customers. When Bob and Ellie Price demanded their money back, the request for a notarized doctor's note was the final straw. Think about the psychological pressure of that, a postal inspector later noted. You're asking a man to go to his primary care physician, a man he sees for his heart health, his flu shots, and ask for a physical measurement of his genitalia to prove a supplement scam. Warshak knew the embarrassment factor was a more effective wall than any legal disclaimer. Chapter 5. The Emails from the Abyss. While Warshak lived the high life, depositing $7.7 million and $16.5 million into personal accounts in a single year, the digital paper trail was becoming a noose. Jason Kosman, the nephew who saw the customers as fish in a barrel, sent an email that stripped away any veneer of legitimacy. He proposed the hospital scheme, calling back canceled customers pretending to be a medical facility offering a clinical-grade version of the supplement. The poor customer bites, Kosman wrote, thinking he's getting a better deal, but he's actually getting taken for a second time. Exploit their shit out of them. Warshak's reply, the student has become the teacher, became the centerpiece of the prosecution. It wasn't just proof of fraud. It was proof of delight in the fraud. Warshak didn't just want the money. He wanted the win. He viewed business as a sport where the customer was the opponent to be tackled for a loss. Chapter 6. The 7-ton Fallout. March 16, 2005. The raid was the beginning of the end. 50 agents, 7 tons of evidence. The scale of the paperwork was so immense that the government had to lease a secure, climate-controlled warehouse just to sort through the unopened mail from customers begging for their life savings back. The trial in 2008 was a spectacle of hubris. Warshak sat in the courtroom, still looking every bit the successful entrepreneur, while a parade of victims told stories of financial ruin and marital strain. I don't think you accidentally start ripping people off, a former employee testified. The sentence was a hammer blow, 25 years in federal prison and a forfeiture of $494 million. The Smiling Bob campaign, once a cultural touchstone of happiness, became a cautionary tale in every business ethics course in the country. Part 2, The Turf and the Treachery. Chapter 7, The Harvard Hustle. Kirk Wright was a man of shadows and light. Born in the Bronx, he had used a settlement from a traumatic car accident to fund a master's degree from Harvard. He arrived in Atlanta at the perfect time the city was a southern boomtown, and Kirk was its most articulate newcomer. International Management Associates EMA wasn't just a hedge fund. It was a membership to an exclusive club. Kirk didn't just target investors, he targeted communities. He moved into the cultural comfort zone of Atlanta's black professional elite, starting with 2 anesthesiologists who had an entrepreneurial bent. He used the right terms, one doctor later admitted: margin calls, short sales, proprietary algorithms. You've heard the words, but you don't really know the mechanics. You trust the man with the Harvard degree to handle the physics while you handle the surgery. The doctors didn't just invest, they recruited. They opened the doors to a world of ample wealth and little-time professionals who were too busy saving lives or building buildings to watch the ticker. Chapter 8, The Locker Room Lore. Then came the athletes. Steve Atwater, a star whose name commanded silence in any Denver locker room, became the bridge. Kirk Wright treated the retired NFL players like royalty. He wasn't just their money manager, he was their peer. He was flying people out for games, hosting dinners at the Georgia Dome, an investigator recalled. He showed them a version of success that was cartoonish Bentleys, Lamborghinis, Aston Martins, to a player who's used to the fast life. Kirk looked like the guy who had cracked the code for life after the league. But the $150 million Kirk claimed to manage was a phantom. The secret recipe for success was a Ponzi scheme of breathtaking simplicity. He used a template off the internet to forge brokerage statements, tracking his own imaginary wins while the real money was being spent on ice-carved bars and marble floors. Chapter 9, The Wedding and the Wall. October 22, 2005. The hedge fund was on the brink of collapse, yet Kirk Wright threw a wedding that cost $500,000. Only a sociopathic personality can conduct himself in that manner, a lawyer noted. You're standing there, drinking champagne from an ice-carved bar, knowing that you've missed payments to the very men standing in the room. You're watching them toast to your health, knowing you've stolen their children's college funds. The acrimony inside IMA was reaching a boiling point. The staff demanded to see a $155 million account statement. Kirk held it up, a piece of paper that was as real as a $3 bill, then locked it in his desk. By January 2006, the runaround had reached its limit. It's the banks, Kirk would say. It's year-end tax activity. Steve Atwater felt physically sick. He realized he hadn't just lost his money, he had led his friends into the lion's den. Chapter 10, The Manhunt. When the FBI raided the EMA offices in February, they found desks and chairs, but no Kirk Wright. The golden boy had vanished. For 3 months, the world watched a bizarre game of cat and mouse. Kirk was hiding in plain sight, giving interviews to the Wall Street Journal from throwaway burner phones. I'm not on the run, he claimed, even as the web tightened. I'm just being careful of my movements. The NFL investors, they're mad. I'm afraid for my personal safety. It was a brilliant piece of theater. He portrayed himself as the victim of investor rage rather than a fugitive from federal justice. But while he was being careful, he was also lounging by the pool at the Ritz-Carlton on South Beach. When the FBI finally surrounded him in Miami, Kirk looked less like a mastermind and more like a man who had finally run out of scripts to read. Chapter 11, The Final Whistle. The trial was a post-mortem of a ruined culture. Kirk's defense that the losses were legitimate trading losses was dismantled by forensic accountants who showed that millions had gone straight into Kirk's pockets. Convicted on all counts on May 21, 2008, Kirk Wright seemed upbeat after the verdict. He met with his lawyers, discussed the appeal, and seemed ready for the long fight. But 3 days later, the Harvard man made his final exit. He ties one end of a bedsheet around his neck and the other around the top bunk. The report read, by the time the guards checked the cell, Kirk Wright was dead. He took the location of the missing millions to the grave. He left behind 500 investors, a second wife who was left with nothing, and a 71-year-old victim whose wife had to return to work just to pay for a rented condo. Part 3, The Anatomy of Aftermath. Chapter 12, The Echoes in the Hallway. The bankruptcy court in Atlanta was a cold, cavernous room that smelled of industrial floor wax and old paper. For the former NFL stars, it was a humiliating new arena. Instead of cheering fans, they faced stone-faced lawyers in cheap suits who picked over the bones of Ema. Where did it go? Steve Atwater asked during a closed session, his voice low and raspy. There were 80 million, 100 million. You're telling us there's nothing. The bankruptcy trustee, a man who had seen 100 Ponzi schemes and felt the weight of each one, adjusted his glasses. We found the cars. Steve, we found the marble in the house. But the liquid cash? It's a vacuum. Wright was living a $1,000 life on a $10,000 credit card. Every new dollar that came in was already spent 3 weeks ago on someone else's profit or a new watch. The tragedy of the NFL pipeline wasn't just the lost money, it was the lost pride. These were men who had built their lives on being invincible. To be blitzed by a man in a tailored suit who spoke softly about Harvard algorithms was a wound that wouldn't close. In another part of the country, Ellie and Bob Price were sitting in their small living room, staring at a stack of credit card statements. The $122 charges had finally stopped, but the emotional tax remained. Every time I see that smiling Bob commercial on TV, Bob whispered, I feel like he's laughing at us, not with us, at us. Chapter 13, The Architect's Lonely Cage. Stephen Warshak, inmate number 43,105, found the silence of federal prison a far cry from the buzzing call centers of Cincinnati. The kinetic energy that had built Berkeley Nutraceuticals was now compressed into a tiny cell. In the first year of his sentence, Warshak still believed in a comeback. He wrote letters to his lawyers, obsessing over procedural errors and administrative overreach. He still viewed himself as a pioneer of the supplement industry, a man who had been unfairly targeted because he was too successful. They're jealous of the grin, he told a fellow inmate during yard time. They couldn't handle the fact that a guy from a basement could outmarket the giants. But the letters from his victims, which the judge had allowed into the record, told a different story. They spoke of ruined marriages, of elderly men who had lost their dignity, and of the thousands who were still waiting for a W or money back promise that was never intended to be kept. One letter from a widow in Ohio simply read, "You didn't just take my money. You took my late husband's faith in people. He died thinking he was a fool because he trusted your smile." Warshak folded the letter and put it in his bunk. For the first time, the grin didn't seem so bright. Chapter 14, The Forgotten Man of the Ritz. Back in Miami, in the months before his capture, Kirkwright had been a man living in a high-speed blur. At the Ritz-Carlton, he would sit by the pool, ordering expensive salads and sipping mineral water while his burner phones buzzed incessantly. Kirk, there at the office, a voice would whisper on the other end, "The feds are taking the hard drives. Let them," Kirk would say, his voice cool and detached. "There's nothing on the hard drives but ghosts. The money is in the ether." It was a delusion he maintained until the very end. Even as the FBI agents approached him on the pool deck, Kirk didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood up, adjusted his sunglasses, and greeted them like old business associates. "I was expecting you," he said, "but you're late for the meeting." The tragedy of Kirkwright was that he had become a character in his own fraud. He had played the Harvard expert for so long that he forgot the Bronx boy who had started with a car wreck settlement. When the sheet was found around his neck, the only thing left was the silence of a man who couldn't face the one thing his algorithm couldn't account for: the truth. Chapter 15, The Residue of Greed. The auction of the Wright Mansion was a grim affair. People came from all over Atlanta to bid on the gold fixtures and the marble slabs. They were looking for a piece of the glamour, oblivious to the fact that they were buying items paid for with the sweat and blood of others. "It's just things," one of the anesthesiologists said, standing on the sidewalk as a crew moved a heavy Italian leather sofa out of the front door. "We thought we were buying a future. We just bought a bunch of expensive furniture for a sociopath." The funny money had finally run out. Stephen Warshak remains in prison, a middle-aged man whose legacy is a cartoon character and a massive forfeiture order. Kirkwright is a grave and a set of unanswered questions. And the American dream, it's still there, flickering in the neon of every late-night commercial and every high-yield investment pitch. It promises you that you can be Bob. It promises you that you can have the Harvard edge. It promises you that the next deal will be the one. But the price of the chase is high. And as Bob, Ellie, Steve, and the 500 other investors learned, sometimes the only way to win is to walk away from the table before the house takes everything you have. Chapter 16, The Cultural Betrayal. In the humid, sprawling suburbs of Atlanta, the betrayal felt deeper than just dollars and cents. For the African American professional community, Kirkwright hadn't just been an investment manager, he had been a symbol of progress. He was the black Harvard man who had made it in the cutthroat world of hedge funds, a field traditionally dominated by white Ivy Leaguers. We wanted him to be real. A retired teacher who had lost her pension admitted, every time we saw him on the news or heard about his success, it felt like a win for all of us. He knew that. He used that pride like a key to get into our bank accounts. Kirk had masterfully exploited the affinity fraud model. He didn't just cold call strangers. He sat in their pews, attended their charity galas, and mentored their children. He was a pillar of the community, which made the discovery of his fraud feel like a desecration. The two anesthesiologists who had first introduced him to the Atlanta scene carried a heavy burden of guilt. They hadn't just lost their own money, they had vouched for a monster. I look at my colleagues now, one said, and I see the suspicion in their eyes. Not for me, maybe, but for the next young man who comes along with a dream and a degree. Kirk didn't just steal money. He poisoned the well of trust for an entire generation. Chapter 17, The Specter of the Bootstrap. Kirk Wright's car wrecked the event that had ostensibly provided his seed money became a central focus for the forensic investigators. They looked into the settlement, the graduate school funding, the early trades. What they found was a man who had been rehearsing his role for years. He was a method actor of finance, a lead detective noted, the Bronx boy, the settlement, the Harvard degree. It was all part of the bootstrap narrative that Americans love. We want to believe that someone can come from nothing and make it to the top. Kirk gave us that story, and we were so in love with the plot that we didn't notice the narrator was a liar. As the FBI combed through the remnants of EMA, they found evidence that Kirk had been running smaller, less sophisticated versions of the scheme since his early 20s. The car wreck settlement hadn't been a springboard. It had been the first taste of easy money that he spent his life trying to replicate. In the end, the secret recipe for stock market success was nothing more than a photocopy of a photocopy. He had built a financial empire on a foundation of nostalgia and aspiration, proving that sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one we want to believe about ourselves. Chapter 18, The Legacy of the Grin. Back in Cincinnati, the Smiling Bob phenomenon had entered its final, ironic stage. The ads were no longer running, but the character had become a cultural ghost. Stephen Warshak watched from behind bars as his creation became a meme for corporate greed and pharmaceutical deception. You see him in the training videos for law enforcement now. A former Berkeley employee said, "Bob is the face of consumer fraud 101. Steve thought he was building a brand. He built a target." The tragedy of Warshak wasn't just the 25-year sentence. It was the realization that his name would forever be linked to a scam. He had wanted to be the next Steve Jobs or Richard Branson, a disruptor who changed the world through marketing. Instead, he was the guy who tricked grandmas into buying sex pills. His family, the mother, the sister, The nephew were all caught in the fallout. The American dream they had hatched in a basement had become a multi-generational criminal enterprise. The subpoenas didn't care about family loyalty. In the federal courtroom, it was every man for himself. The student has become the teacher, the prosecutor repeated during the closing arguments, pointing at the infamous email. And the teacher is going to spend the rest of his productive life in a classroom made of bars and concrete. Chapter 19, The Silent Hunters. While Rorschach and Wright were basking in the glow of their fraudulent empires, a small team of federal agents was working in the shadows of windowless offices. These weren't men in tailored suits. They were the silent hunters of the U.S. Postal Inspection Service and the FBI. For Special Agent Marcus Reed, the Berkeley case wasn't about sex pills. It was about the mail. People forget that the post office is a federal fortress, Reed said, leaning over a desk buried in credit card statements. Every time Rorschach sent a deceptive mailer or a fraudulent bottle through the system, he was knocking on the door of a prison cell. He just didn't know it yet. The investigation was a slow, agonizing process of connecting dots. They didn't have a smoking gun initially. They had 1,000 paper cuts. Each complaint from a customer like Ryan or the prices was a single thread. Reed's job was to weave them into a noose. We spent months just listening to the call center recordings, Reed recalled, listening to the Michael Johnson transfers, watching the money hop from account to account like a terrified rabbit. It's not flashy work. It's boring, repetitive, and meticulous, but it's how you catch a man who thinks he's smarter than the system. In Atlanta, the hunt for Kirk Wright had a different flavor. It was high speed and high stakes. The agents there were dealing with a man who could move millions with a keystroke and disappear into the luxury of South Beach. Wright was a ghost, an FBI agent noted. But even ghosts leave footprints in the digital sand. Every time he used a burner phone to call the Wall Street Journal, he was giving us a coordinate. Every time he swiped a card at the Ritz, he was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. Chapter 20, The Ripple of Ruin. The siphoning of wealth didn't just affect the investors, it devastated the foot soldiers of the empires. At Berkeley Nutraceuticals, hundreds of employees found themselves unemployed and toxic. I have Berkeley on my resume, a former call center rep cried. I can't get a job anywhere in Cincinnati. People look at me like I was the one pressing the charge button on their grandmothers. We were just kids trying to pay rent. We believed the hype. The psychological toll on the employees was a silent secondary fraud. Rorschach hadn't just stolen from the public. He had stolen the professional reputations of his neighbors. He had turned a generation of local workers into accomplices in a scam they barely understood. In Atlanta, the ripple effect was more intimate. Families were torn apart as the reality of Kirk's fraud settled in. Husbands and wives who had celebrated at the $500,000 wedding were now facing foreclosure together. It's the quiet after the storm that kills you